where do I see the field of Latin American history going in the next 10 years? I've always joked that I'm not very good at knowing what the next big wave is going to be, because it would be really great. I'd say, okay, my next project, I know where it's going, and my next project is going to be on X, wherever it's going. So I'm typically not someone who feels comfortable or confident predicting the direction of the field. I do think that increasingly work on Latin America and everywhere is transnational, so I think that it'll become less and less common for somebody to study just Brazil or just Argentina or just Mexico or just Paraguay, that people will increasingly be preferring topics that allow them to go across borders in their research. And I think increasingly people will be doing hemispheric research. So people who work on Latin America will also do projects that include, for example, the United States or the Anglophone Caribbean. So I think the boundaries of the field will expand to include areas that were not normally thought of as part of Latin America. A lot of people who are working on the Philippines, for example, now think of their work as connected to Latin America and vice versa. So I do think that's going to become an ever stronger aspect of the field. I think another aspect of the field that is kind of in a state of resurgence, as it is in the United States, is sort of the history of capitalism and economic history, but I think it's a kind of new economic history that is not as strictly quantitative as an earlier economic history had been. And I think also we're increasingly engaged with visual sources, and people will be using visual not just written documents or textual documents, but also visual documents, or using visual sources as documents, particularly for doing certain kinds of sort of the history of the indigenous people, of non-literate people in Latin America. And that includes, that's not just in the colonial period, but well into the 20th century, large portions of the Latin American population were not literate. And so what the kinds of documentation we can use to get at their lives are typically not written texts. And then I would say that we will probably continue to have a rethinking of what we might call the sort of failure narrative of Latin American history. That is the narrative that, why didn't Latin America become more democratic? Why didn't it become more developed? Why isn't it more like the United States? Why isn't it more unified? Why isn't it more stable? So these kinds of what is wrong with Latin America for many years was what shaped the field of Latin American history. And my sense is that people are now very much trying not to start off with that assumption, and rather trying to look at the ways in which, for example, Latin America had certain aspects in the 19th century that made it more democratic than the United States, for example, at the same time. Latin American countries were much faster at abolishing slavery, were much more likely to have egalitarian views about race relations. So I think there's a way in which people are now trying to rethink that failure narrative and not replace it with a success narrative necessarily, but sort of see what the problems are when you're already starting out with the notion that somehow Latin American history is a history of failure. It would have been a little easier to do this a couple of years ago, when there was a sense that a number of Latin American countries, including Brazil, were really in a period of robust economic growth and democratic process and so on. Things have been, over the last few years, more discouraging, but I don't think we're going to then just go back to the old failure narrative. I think we kind of have gone over a certain hill, and that now we're going to, even in light of the more depressing circumstances of the last couple of years, I don't think we'll return to the failure narrative.